Good morning. Good morning. You guys don't have enough coffee yet. Or people are, I'm Shirley Leung. I'm looking for my notes. Of course, I wrote them out, and now I'm going to have to memorize them. Let's see. Hold it. I'm so sorry here. I thought it was all prepared. It was picture day today at school.
There was everything.
I was dealing with Gel and the boys. All right, I'm going to have to wing it. I don't know where my email is. Anyways, I'm going to see if I'm going to memorize this. Tom Bourdon, he's head of diversity at Staples. It's a Framingham-based office supply chain, and he has promised me that after this panel, we can all hit that was easy button, right? That's you. We have Tyler Muse. He's from New York. He's the founder and CEO of Lingo Live. It's a New York company that provides, look, I'm memorizing this, that helps, you help global employees and you help them with language, right? Using online lessons. That's actually kind of very cool. And you have a booth here too, right?
We do.
So hope you guys can check it out. We have KeyAnna Schmiedl. KeyAnna Schmiedl. She is the global head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Wayfair. That's the Boston company that everyone gets their furniture from.
That's
and
right.
Furnishings with the click of a button. And you guys have a new store, right?
We
Brick
do.
and mortars.
In Natick, in the Natick Mall, so come check it out. It's adorable. I love it. I shouldn't be there as often as I am. I don't need more Wayfair stuff, or maybe I do. But yes, it's local. Come check it out. Let us know your thoughts. Share your feedback.
And then we have Dionne Poulton, who's the head of diversity at Riverside Community Care. That's a Dedham nonprofit. It provides mental health care and human services for teens, kids, and adults. Pretty good, right? Anything
Awesome.
else?
You did a really good job.
Thank you. I just learned this for today, and that's it, right?
Good job, Shirley.
Anyways, welcome to day one, and this is a really great panel. I wish I could see you guys a little bit more. I guess I should move this. Anyways.
Hold on.
We can move
Yeah,
back.
okay, we'll go back.
Wait, can I
We
do
can go
Wayfair
back.
style?
There you go.
Yes.
I'm gonna take, oh wait, I'll take this off. I'll do like, I feel like I can
better.
see. Okay, this is
Alright.
much better.
Much better. Yes.
First of all, in each of your shops, what is the #1 pressing diversity and inclusion issue?
Oh,
We just
okay.
rolled
I
out
feel
the
the
lines.
eyes. Okay, we're online. So I've been with Staples for just about 6 months now. And I think a lot of times when you go into these big corporations, you see a lot of similar challenges. So there's a lot that we're dealing with. I feel very lucky to talk with so many leaders who are super engaged and talk about how important this is. The challenge that I know so many others experience is actually getting that time and attention you need to move the needle. So I think oftentimes the commitment is there in theory, but to be able to spend that time doing the work can be challenging, especially when there's so much pressure on profit and transitioning a company and all of those different outside factors.
Tyler, you want to jump in?
Sure. So I think one of our biggest kind of cultural, I hesitate to use the word issue, I guess, concerns is psychological safety more generally. We are an early stage startup, and we've gone through a number of different evolutions as a company. As you mentioned, we started kind of teaching language lessons online, and now we're offering kind of more broader coaching services. And as a result of that, certain departments have become redundant, and so we've had to lose people that we really care about because we don't have, the funding of a bigger company. And so what's happened as a result is there's obviously, psychological safety concerns of how do I make sure that my role and everything is relevant. And then when you layer on top of that, any type of concerns that folks have because of backgrounds that they come from or gender or some of these other things, you layer that in on top of what are already issues for anybody in the company. And it's tricky. So what I try to do, I know we were talking about this before, KeyAnna, is just be radically transparent and honest with people and try to, one of the benefits of being a smaller startup is I can actually meet with you one-on-one. So I'm actually, in the past, it's kind of like my door's always open. Now I'm like meeting with people one-on-one and just trying to get their pulse on like, what do I need to know that I don't know? How can I help? not you specifically, but like others in the company. You be my advocate. Help me understand what's going on that I need to be aware of, because I fully acknowledge this is a time of transition and that there are a lot of like question marks in the company. And I think that people appreciate that kind of honesty and that transparency. And I know we'll talk about trust later, but I think, yeah, just being radically transparent is a big part of helping to solve the psychological safety.
So to that, I mean, yes and yes. And what I would say is, you know, having folks in the organization who are in different places when it comes to DEI, right? Either the point in the conversation, you have some folks who are ready to have the race, the gender specific conversation. You have some folks who are like, what do we mean when we say unconscious bias? What's the difference between equality and equity? And how do you make sure everybody's kind of getting what they need so that the conversation is moving forward and that you're not necessarily holding people to wait as others come up and come along? And how do you deputize others to say, hey, I know you're further along in the discussion. Let's help other folks get there. Do this with me so that they still feel connected and energized and like they're a part of that. I think a couple of different things are key here, especially when I think about the leadership piece itself, which we'll probably end up talking more about. But it's this idea that you really need to move from a place of being careful in these conversations to a place of being thoughtful. So really just taking that time to say, like, I don't want to dip in and out of this conversation. I don't want to treat it like a Fabergé egg where I'm like, yes, important, somebody please take this from me so I don't break it. It's I want to sit down, I want to engage with you, but what do we need in order for that to be a successful conversation, since I might not be in the place where you're at?
We have that issue as well. But I would say our biggest issue, because we're a large behavioral health and human services agency, we provide service to the community. We serve 46,000 people a year who have cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities. We have schools. We have a huge trauma center that responds to different events. We responded to the Boston bombings a few years ago. So our services are across a wide spectrum. But of late, the biggest concern that we've had is how do you balance the whole notion of the customer is always right, but with also protecting the integrity of our staff. In the last couple years, we've had an uptick of racial, homophobic, everything you can think of, sexist remarks and that have been made towards our employees from family members of the people that we serve. So that's been a huge thing that we've been dealing with. And as a result, we decided to implement the Hate Has No Home campaign. I'm sure you must be familiar with that as D&I executives. And it's really been a very, it's been a really, really supportive tool that we can go to and say, you know what, this is what our policy is. We also have a mutual respect policy, and we couple that with the Hate Has No Home campaign, and those two together cover how we think our staff should be treated and how we think our clients should be treated. And so that's what we've been working on quite a bit the last few months.
That's fascinating.
Thank you.
And have you, so how did this come, did the employees come to you and how did this come about, this program about dealing with customers? I mean, usually when you think of D&I issues, it's internal, but this is fascinating that you have had external issues.
Well, you know what? To the point of this panel, it's having a leader, Scott Bach, who's the CEO of Riverside. He actually the founder. The company was actually, the organization was founded in a church back 35 years ago, and it has evolved. We now have over almost 1,500 employees. So you can imagine how big we are and how much he's and I would credit him for his willingness to be flexible and to be open and be responsive to what he learns. So he learned about what was happening. We recognized, just doing some pulse checks around the organization, that this was actually a pattern that was happening, not just one-off things. So we said, you know what, we need to institute something that's gonna actually address this issue. And so to his credit, he just says, you know what, let's just do it. And so that's part of my job, which is to go around the organization and make sure that everybody is being treated fairly, but at the same time also understanding that sometimes people also, they also say and do things because they're not cognitively aware. So it's how do you strike that balance of understanding that, you know, maybe sometimes people don't know what they're doing, but other times, sometimes they do know, and how do we hold them accountable?
So many people at this conference are diversity and inclusion leaders, but what happens when you have units run by leaders who are not inclusive? I've heard this come up with rank and file employees at other companies, and so I was wondering, what advice would you give to people who have bosses who don't get it?
I don't know if we're going to keep going down the line. I can start because I feel like it'll get better from me onwards. So I'll start. I think like I keep coming back to this concept of honest conversations. Like if you have someone where you're feeling they're not being inclusive, it's hard to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they are oblivious and they don't intend to come across this way. But I think you kind of have to give yourself the courage to actually have that crucial conversation with this person. Not to say you should just go out and say what's on your mind. I think that's really something that you need to work with someone else who you trust, whether that be a coach, which obviously we're big advocates for. Coaching is a really powerful way to help you articulate what you need to say to somebody in a situation that's really difficult. But if your company doesn't provide coaching, even a friend, someone that you trust, someone who's always had your back, if you're going to say, look, I have this boss that I just don't feel like understands what's going on with me. I feel like they're making inappropriate comments. I don't know if it's if they're aware of what they're doing or not. And I don't know how to breach that topic. I think that's something you should practice with somebody you trust first. Get to a place where you feel confident doing it, and then go have that conversation with this person. And worst case scenario, you've spoken your truth. Obviously, that's as much as you can do. And then if that isn't successful, which we have found because we deal with this a lot, folks who have to have these like really difficult conversations. If usually that is all that's needed for somebody to realize, I had no idea I was coming across this way. But if it's not, then you've obviously got to get your HR team involved. If you feel like, look, I already had this conversation, this is what I said, I have it documented because I followed up with an email, and I'm not seeing the behavior change from this person, that person should not be in a leadership position. Like if they have become aware of the way that they are coming across and they haven't changed their behavior or committed to any action steps, that is out of my hands. You guys need to figure this out because this is unacceptable.
So I would say to that, again, I completely agree. I think it's, if it's your direct manager especially, or your direct leader, talking with folks in your employee resource groups, finding who your people are that you can have that conversation with. A lot of times it's people feel like, I just want to suss out, is this just me? Is this happening with anyone else? And so being able to hear, like, it's not just me, is also helpful. And then saying, okay, so now what do I want to do about it? And going through all of those other steps that Tyler just mentioned. I think the other piece for me, and something that we recently went through, I've been at Wayfair for 2 months. I took a look at our competencies and I said, where is our inclusive language? So we built in inclusive language to our competencies because we do hold leaders, employees, managers, you name it, accountable to these competencies. We have 360 reviews where managers get upward feedback, they get feedback from their peers, they get feedback from their superiors. And so now you're accountable for noticing where are they or aren't they being inclusive. And instead of making it its own bucket, which I know there's a conversation between, do we separate it out? We baked it in. Because it's you already know what these competencies are, we're telling you how we expect you to carry them out, right? Because that inclusivity comes out in the behaviors. So how do we leverage that tool and have the systems in place so that people have more recourse than just I'm sitting here, what do I do about this?
KeyAnna, can you give an example of inclusive language that you built into the... What do you mean by that?
Yes. So we had some language that said things to the effect of like vocal contributor to the team, right? And so for me, there were some other descriptors in there that I said, okay, we're bumping up against some gendered terminology here, we're bumping up against Western-centered cultural values, and introversion, extroversion. So what exactly are we getting at? We're getting at proactively does something, right? So instead of vocal contributor, proactively contributes to the team. And that can come in many different forms and facets, so that we're also saying to managers, we don't want the ambiguity of you're reading vocal as literal vocal, right? And so I didn't hear you speak up in that meeting, so no, you're not meeting this competency. Now it's the proactivity. It also puts an action on the manager to say, in order for maybe your introverts to be part of the meeting and have an opportunity to be proactive, send that agenda out ahead of time. Give them time to review it so that they can send you something ahead of time or be prepared to introduce something in the meeting. So being able to say there's accountability on both sides, like let's not just put this on our employees, let's say, but the managers have to create the environment, really helps us to do that.
I want to acknowledge that if you're dealing with a manager or supervisor who's not being inclusive, those power dynamics are very real. Like, addressing the situation can be very uncomfortable. And I think if a company is setting, or organization is setting up the environment in a way where people realize we all have work to do in this area, we're all responsible for, you know, having bias and little microaggressions we might not be aware of. If that's the environment we're working with, then hopefully if something's addressed, it's in the spirit of creating an environment where everyone's set up to succeed, meaning the supervisor, the people reporting to that person. So hopefully if that's the way you go into a conversation, I love your idea, or what you mentioned in terms of whether you do it yourself or you work with a coach or maybe you go in with someone. When something's addressed, it's done saying, look, we want to create this culture of inclusion where I can do my best, you can help me get there. This is something I'm grappling with and I want to work through it, right? Because I think oftentimes when people address any of this, it can feel potentially confrontational or so high stakes that it might implode, you know. So to go in with that mind frame, I think, can be really helpful.
So I come from this space, just having been in many different workplaces and coaching different people. I come from this space where people are generally well-intentioned, and I think if they make a mistake, it's important to ask a clarifying question. So if, for example, you said something that was offensive, I would say, even if it's not in the moment, I can go back and come back and say, you know what, you said this to me, and ask a clarifying question and say, this is how I received what you said. Can you please clarify what you meant? Because this is how I received it. And give that person an opportunity to actually circle back and clarify. And then that's when you really know what someone has done and what their intentions are. Because I think sometimes we can, I don't say fly off the handle, but sometimes we have, everybody has their junk. They have their experiences, they have their upbringing that all play into how we perceive and interpret situations. So sometimes our interpretation of something is not necessarily the truth. It's not necessarily the truth. So it's important to give that person an opportunity to self-correct. And I always refer to the notion of an impact versus intent versus impact. I'll give you an analogy. So if this is a swimming pool and I jump in the middle, cannonball, and I intend to hit this lady here in the blue pants, inevitably I'm going to hit everybody else. So my intent was actually just to hit you, but I'm hitting everybody else. So I use that analogy because sometimes we say things that are in the presence of others because we have a comfort level. And I've had to do a lot of mediations with this. So I would say something to you in a meeting because you and I have a comfort level, but there's somebody that's listening that's in earshot and takes offense to that. So that's an opportunity to say, you know what, you have to be careful what we say because people are around and what you're saying may not be received the same way by all people. Mm-hmm. So again, that's why I think it's important to really, really clarify how people are perceiving and how they're experiencing different things. And I think it's worked really well.
So politics used to be the third rail in the workplace, but now you have CEOs taking a stand on everything from gun control to reproductive rights. And so how do you navigate the diversity of political opinions that are being expressed in the workplace these days? And KeyAnna, I was hoping you could start off this conversation because of the recent employee walkout at Wayfair over the Bourdon contract. Mm-hmm. And you probably had to deal with this quite a bit, right?
Yeah, and so thank you for that question because I think it's important. For me and what I have found at Wayfair, so the walkout happened probably a week after I accepted my offer at Wayfair.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, okay. And I used a clarifying question, help me to understand, like what's the what? And so coming into Wayfair, it wasn't that leaders were sitting on their hands, and it wasn't that employees were just so angry. It was that everyone was in conversation, and they were trying to figure out what's the right next step, what's the right ask for the people that want something to change, and how do we listen, what's the forum that we create to hear people out. And that's exactly what needs to happen, right? Like, you want to welcome those voices. I think especially in DEI work, what I have found is that it is so important to, one, find out who are the people who don't believe in what you're selling, who take issue with what you're selling, and spend time with them. Because if you can turn one of them, if you can get them to understand, if you can figure out what's in it for me for them, then they can become your biggest advocates. They can help to evangelize, this is how we make decisions and this is why we came to this. So what we're doing at Wayfair is we put together a group of diverse folks, and I use that term holistically, meaning people of different tenures from 6 months to there since the company was founded, different layers of the organization, so baseline employees to senior leaders, different age ranges, race, ethnicity, all of that stuff. And we said, this is what we do. We hire smart people, we say, here's the issue, and we get a group of diverse folks together to help us figure it out. And the company said, look, we are the senior leaders, but we want to know, what do you need from us? What are you looking for from us? What's your recommendation, so that we can take that to heart? And I think what's also important too is that group has people that both support, who we're selling to and why, and people who don't. And so having that debate and that conversation and saying, we're going to look at the recommendations that come from your representatives, just makes it that much easier for people to say, okay, they're taking us seriously, they're doing something, so let's work with them. Let's assume the best of intentions, let's trust and then verify, and be with you in the conversation. And I think it also acknowledges that you have employees who are engaged, who are saying this company matters to us. And so you have to be able to hear that as part of what they're calling out as well, because they care about the organization, they want to see it be successful. So how can you tell them that you hear that as part of their message too?
KeyAnna, you must have a young, the startup, Tyler, your company too must have a fairly young employee, younger side, millennials. I guess Gen Zs aren't working yet, right?
They are.
They are working, okay.
They are.
And so, do you find that that group is more vocal about their political opinions than, the Gen Xers or baby boomers, and how do you manage that?
So I guess what I would say to that is, I don't know that this group is necessarily more vocal about their political opinions. I think that they are more public about their political opinions, right? So I think that you will find from baby boomers on, everybody was talking about politics, but they were doing it in their protected groups. They were doing it as, aside. And as a millennial myself, but an older one, I don't tweet. However, I do know that people go to Twitter and they're like, I have this opinion, I have this thought, and they put it out there. And so when you have a generation of people that are so used to doing that, to saying, you know what, this has reached a boiling point for me, or I'm frustrated, or I'm super excited about something and I need to let the world know, then there's just a different type of both management, engagement, kind of conversation that needs to happen. And it's not necessarily the preventative conversation, but it's the understanding, what are you hoping to gain by doing that, and how can we achieve those goals together, whether or not you decide to hit send on that tweet.
Yeah, I think I say we because I'm also an older millennial, but technically a millennial. I think we crave authenticity more than anything. And so you mentioned like there's a third rail in terms of, if you bring politics or really anything that's deeply personal and maybe rubs people the wrong way or has a tendency to be a little bit provocative into who you are as a leader, there's obviously a risk with that, but there's also a risk in not doing that, right? Like if you are just this entity as a leadership team that isn't a human being, you're just a member of the leadership team and you're focused on OKRs and all these things, it's really hard for people to trust you, feel like they can connect with you, unless they understand who you are as a human being. And so there's easy things to talk about, like I'm a dad, I have 2 kids, all these things about my personal life that aren't profound or provocative or whatever. But then there's some of your political leanings that that I think you have to express. I think with folks who are in the millennial or Gen Z, but really I have found most people, they crave that authenticity. They want to know what you stand for. They want to know who you are as a person. And as long as you can couple that with, this is who I am as a person. This is not what the organization stands for. The organization has these core values, these principles. You can see some of them applied to, my personal beliefs because it's hard to decouple them. But if I have offended you in any way, or if we disagree on something that's really important to you, it kind of goes back to that self-awareness that you talked about. Like, let me hear you. I want to sit down and understand your perspective, and at the very least, agree to disagree and say, look, this is just my personal belief. I understand yours. I'm not trying to force any of this on you, but I'm also not trying to hide who I am as a leader in this company, because I think it's important that you follow a human being and not an entity.
One thing that I'll add here is the importance of generational context, right? So when you think of why we group generations in the way that we do, one of those factors, or even dimensions of diversity, one of those factors is what was going on in the era that you were, developing into your adult self, right? Those pivotal years for you. And when we think about millennials, when we think about Gen Z, we have to think about the context of what's going on in the world. And so you have a group of people from 9/11 to what's going on in politics right now, who this has been their world. This has been what has shaped them. So it stands to reason that they would expect different and talk different about these things. And so how are we equipping leaders who may or may not be part of that generation, who may or may not agree with the most vocal of the folks? How are we equipping them to understand the ask in context and ensuring that they're meeting these folks where they're at, right? In the same way that for baby boomers, it was just a different context. For Gen Xers, it was just a different context. How are we doing that here? And I don't think that lens has been applied enough.
So at Riverside, we have staff who are from age 19 all the way to over 65. So it's a wide range of people. And because we deal with such difficult issues, suicide, disability, and so it's kind of the antithesis to say, oh, we can't talk about this because we're dealing with difficult issues all the time. So we actually provide a safe space for people to actually have the conversation, and then we go back to that mutual respect policy. You can have a different perspective, political affiliation, but you still have to show respect. And so we teach people all the time, how do you engage in constructive dialogue where you're not alienating somebody and making somebody feel like they're less than because of who they are and what they do. So we work for a nonprofit, and people assume, okay, nonprofit means liberal, but we do have people who are not liberal who work there. So how do we make sure everyone feels included? And the other piece is that, I think in any workplace environment, we cannot be expected to check who we are at the door before we get to work. We spend 8 hours a day at work, and that's who we are. So there should be a space made available through somebody who knows how to facilitate proper conversations, because we know that can go completely awry in a second. But just make sure that I think organizations should provide a space where people can actually have conversations. So part of my job is not just sitting in an office, I actually go into the field. And say for example, if something happens at a particular site, I'll get a phone call, okay, this is what happened, I'll do a site visit, I'll have a conversation, I'll facilitate a conversation with everybody, and then go back and create a targeted training to kind of address that particular issue or what is coming up, and just really, really engage with each leader in each particular environment to make sure that there's sustainability in what we're saying. It's not just, oh, here we go, and then we leave. It's make sure we're just going to keep reinforcing what we want to do. And so that's really been a good tool that's been helping, a model that I created, and it's really been helping a lot.
I'll just add two things. First of all, I think it is important at some point for companies to say, these are our values, and when we have a point of view that needs to be spoken aloud, we have to, because if we're saying this is who we are, this is what we value, and something's going on out in society or in the community that's in direct opposition of that, it's really important to do that. And then the other thing I'll say is I really agree that there is oftentimes more harm done if we don't speak up. And KeyAnna, like you were saying, there is an expectation now that we will be authentic and we will take a stand. And I think companies that aren't willing to do that ultimately will fall behind and eventually fail. And it's hard, and you want to go about inclusion in a way that is inclusive of all, and oftentimes people will say, well, this inclusion you're talking about feels political, like it's leaning more this way than that way. And again, that's where I come back to this idea of that's when you have to say, these are our values and we will stick by them.
Yeah, and it's going back to Dionne's point on the intent versus impact. I think if you can be vulnerable and just say, here's what I'm trying to do, this is really uncomfortable for me, I'm trying to kind of facilitate this open conversation, but at the same time, the impact may be totally different from what I'm intending to do. So if this is having a negative or adverse impact, like I want to hear from you, or we should talk about that openly as a company as well.
Yeah, and I guess I go to, thinking about leaders at organizations and where are they coming from, like their educational background, what has their experience been, and if that education, if that experience has been training them to be the leaders of yesterday, that's not incredibly effective right now, right? And so there are certainly certain skill sets that I think are not flexed enough. Humility is a part of that, right? It is okay to stand up there and as the leader say, I do not have all of the answers. This isn't my area of expertise. I'm going to get some of this wrong, but I promise you that I'm trying and I want to move forward with you, but I need your help. Like, help me to understand, right? And in the D&I space, I do this all the time because I know what I know a little bit of what I don't know a lot, right? And so when we talk about like how do you get leaders to understand they're not being inclusive and all of that, sometimes it's just me modeling the behavior that I would like them to use and letting them see the positive reaction that people have to that and saying it's okay. I don't feel like I'm less good at my job. I feel like I'm just being honest with folks. And also the answers are out there, right? Like I look out to this room and I'm like, I could ask all of you this question and you would probably have brilliant answers. So why do we always kind of sit alone with this and say, I've got to figure this out, I'm the leader of whatever? No, let's put it out there. Let's crowdsource this, right? And especially when we think about the younger generations, that's what they're used to. They're used to working in groups. They're used to going out. They're used to crowdsourcing what's the best X, Y, or Z. And I'm still going like, Google, what's the closest thing to me? And so I need to leverage some of their tactics too, right? In order to be the successful leader that they're looking for me as well.
Can I just make one more point on that? So I think too, like we have the leader, and of course there's the head, and then we have the different departments who are also leaders. Mm-hmm. And I think it's extremely important to see what that head really thinks, because the body doesn't do what the head doesn't know. And sometimes if there's no consistency and there's no accountability when people go astray from what that leader really, really expects. I'm also housed in the HR department. So, our CEO, he's very cut and dry. We want this, we want that. And whoever can't get on board, you have to find another option. And so it's a matter of, do you have the courage to to stick to your guns and say, you know what, this is what we believe, this is who we are, this is who I want us to be. And if any behavior goes kind of not in line with that, then we have to make a decision on what you do. Either that person gets on board, they have to just move on somewhere else, because we have to keep thinking about the culture that we're trying to create, which is the culture of inclusivity. We cannot have an exclusive workplace environment while we're trying to be inclusive of people with disabilities. It doesn't make any sense. You can't reconcile the two. So we really, really stress that you have to just be inclusive in any way possible. And if you don't have the tools, we can teach you the tools to do so.
So one way to assess how inclusive your workplace is through the company survey. Of course, I'm looking at Claudia and Paul from the Globe, and I owe you guys my diversity survey. When's the deadline? Thursday. Oh, okay, I better get going. Not too late. Anyways, so do you guys have any do's and don'ts about how to conduct a diversity workplace questionnaire and how best to use those results? Dionne, I was hoping you could start off this conversation because your company just went through this.
Sure, yes. So actually in Riverside's 35-year history, I administered their first culture diversity survey ever a few months ago. And not to put the light on me, but nonetheless, I really think that every organization should have one, because it establishes a baseline of behavior. It gives you metrics on where you are at this given time, and how you can't assess your progress without knowing where you started. I administered the survey to all 1,500 employees. We ended up getting 328 responses, which is roughly 20%, which is actually pretty good for an organization. And there are 35 questions just asking people about their experiences with their supervisors. Do they feel supported? What's the atmosphere like? What are your perceptions of advancement in the organization in terms of diversity getting higher? And just your general experience going to work every day. Do you feel safe? Do you feel like people are respecting you? And so it was actually it's a very good tool as well, because the results of that survey, all the results of those surveys help you in terms of how do you change your policies, how do you change your programming, how do you update or change your programming, what types of trainings you have to implement. So as a result of that, we got a whole bunch of information. And one big thing that came out of that was just the experience of the LGBTQ community at our site. We have a large community, and interesting, we had 8 people declare on the survey that they were part of the LGBTQ community, and as a result of that, and people sharing on the survey that their pronouns are not being respected, I put out a call and said, you know what, let's do a focus group. So I facilitated a focus group last week Tuesday, and I had 18 people show up. 3 people said they couldn't come, so that's way more than what was actually said on the survey, which indicates that there's a feeling of safety. And so when they came into the room, I said, okay, tell me why you're here. And the majority said, you know what, I was just surprised, because no one's ever said, let me hear what your experience is like. And so we had a great conversation. It was a very deep conversation to find out what was happening for them. The mistake that people make is that they're a monolithic group. They're not monolithic. There are different beliefs about whether they should have to put their pronouns or not. So we actually have a policy at Riverside where it's optional to put your below your signature, his, him, her, or they, and that's your right. But the bottom line is, what I learned from that is that the choice should be there, because some people actually express that sometimes the pronouns they use at home are not the same pronouns they use at work, and it's a matter of safety, and it's a matter of how people are experiencing them. So that was a really good instructive conversation, and otherwise it wouldn't have happened if I did the survey.
Out of curiosity, what was the racial and gender breakdown of the respondents?
So interesting. So of the 3, so we're largely a white organization. There were 200. So of the 328 people, over 200 were white employees. Yes, and then the second largest population were Black employees in one particular division, and then we have people from Atlantic Hawaiian. We had a whole range, Chinese as well. So we had a huge range of people, but the majority were white employees. And we had and the survey actually yielded 228 responses from the people, just kind of saying, this is what we think, this is what we want, da-da-da. So it was actually a really good tool to find out what's really going on.
Okay, panel, you see those big numbers, right? Oh. We got 3 minutes left, so lightning round. Does one other person want to respond?
Sure, I was going to say, so at Wayfair we have our annual voice survey. This year we are adding 15 questions on inclusion. So everything from have you experienced tokenism to would members of your network feel comfortable working here, to get a sense broadly from the community. How do you feel about being here? What's going on for our population? And not just for the people who feel like it might be different for them, but also folks who observe that it may be different for others, so that we know where to dig deep and have these focus groups. The other thing is I am incredibly lucky. I work with a DEI analytics team that the head of that team has a PhD and has done stuff in gender studies. So she created 60 DEI questions, and people found out about it, and it is like the new best, hottest thing. So the ERGs want to use it, and they want to put it out to members of their group. We have specific departments who have said, can we leverage questions from that survey? We're trying to figure out, could we do DEI pulse checks throughout the year leveraging those questions? So for us, it's people are hungry for this. They want to know what kinds of questions are out there, because a lot of times they just don't know how to express exactly what this feeling is that I have. So being able to give them the terminology, the words to put to that, and then to have us be able to take that and say, this is the theme of what we're hearing, and so here are some ways that we can implement change in the organization is incredibly important.
All right, so this will be the last question because we've got like less than 2 minutes, but this is the lightning round. So if there's one takeaway you want to leave with the audience about being an inclusive leader, what would that be? Tom, start us off.
All right. So my one takeaway has 3 things, but it's quick.
Hurry.
I think we could move mountains if leaders knew day to day to say to the people who report to them, how are you doing? How can I support you? And thank you. I think those 3 things, if everyone felt that day to day in their job, it would be incredible.
How are you doing?
How are you doing? How can I support you? And somehow figure out a way to thank them for what they are doing. That's nutshell. Yeah.
Good.
I think for me, the big takeaway, I don't remember, KeyAnna, if it was you who said it, was around humility. Obviously, I've been talking about this quite a bit, but I think just thinking about it's okay to not know what is the appropriate way to talk about these things. And if you can be humble and acknowledge that and say, this is uncomfortable for me. I'm a white male CEO. I'm the most like classic definition of kind of what you would expect in a CEO. And I don't know how to approach certain situations. And I want to acknowledge that my intent is to listen. My intent is to hear you. But in the process, I'm probably going to say things that make me look like a buffoon. And I just want to acknowledge that and say, please tell me if I'm doing that. I think that humility goes a long way in creating the psychological safety of this person's uncomfortable too. We're all kind of trying to figure this out together. And more importantly, they're wanting to listen. So I'm going to hold them accountable to that.
So I would say moving from careful to thoughtful conversations, and what you need in order to do that is you need trust. So you need to trust your people that they will, hold you. And also you need for people to assume the best of intentions, right? Because you're not going to get your leaders to go there if people are going to immediately jump down their throats. But people aren't going to be willing to have the patience if the leaders don't go there.
I think authenticity is a precursor to congruency. If you just make sure that your deeds and your words should be in alignment as much as possible. And if you're in a situation where you discover it's not, it's important to do the work. Not necessarily in the workplace, but do the work outside. So if you're going to have Chinese food, don't go to Chinatown. Don't just go to a upscale, whatever. Get opportunities to have immersive experiences with different people, and that way you minimize your risk of having those kind of gaffes and those kind of mistakes. So that would be my suggestion.
Great. Thank you, Tom from Staples, Tyler from Lingo Live, KeyAnna from Wayfair, and Dionne from Riverside Community Care.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Are only over by a minute.